homeland of the Karelian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. So welcome. And I'm looking forward to spending this half hour with you. I hope that you enjoy it. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can speak to me directly by typing your comments or questions into whatever platform you may be watching the show on, and they will show up here in my chat room, and we can talk directly. And I find that one of the better parts of this particular broadcast. As you may know, I've been doing different kinds of broadcasts for many, many years. And the ease of communication in this one, I find to be very pleasurable. Today, I was planning to talk again about education. Maybe jumping around a little bit in terms of exactly what aspects of education I'm going to talk about, but I wanted to talk more on the subject of communication. I also want to take a moment to shamelessly plug my Patreon at revdonlewis.com. If you like my work, if you'd like to support my work, you can most easily do that by joining my Patreon or by creating or by reserving a reading with me, which you can do by emailing me at donlewishp@aol.com or instant messaging me on Facebook and or Instagram, or buying something at karelianpublishing.com. And I hope everyone is having a good day as we continue our topic of education. Yesterday, we were talking a lot about critical thinking skills. We were talking about knowing what is and is not truly important. And we got off into the subject of language. And, to me, it is partly because I'm a Gemini. And Geminis, as a general rule, are given to language. But language is one of the more important subjects in education in my mind. I'm a very great believer in it. I find the history of language to be fascinating. And, I find it interesting that I'm still learning more, even at this age, about how certain words came to be what they are. Things that when I was younger I thought were I don't want to say mispronunciations, but different pronunciations that had crept in over the years have actually been there from the very beginning. In some cases, the way that words are spelled never went with how they were pronounced in the English language, which is quite an interesting thing to realize. One that I often like to talk about is the word ax, if you're going to ask someone a question. And I've heard all sorts of different stories about where this word comes from, ranging from the idea that it is an Ebonic word to its influenced by pronunciation styles in Africa. But the reality is it's a Middle English word. In Middle English, there was not a universal form for spelling, and not necessarily for pronunciation either. If you were a speaker of Middle English, you might have said ask, or you might have said ax, depending on where exactly you lived and what your connections were. As the Middle English language developed into Modern English and also into Scottish, each one took a different version of this word. And in Modern English, the word is ask. In Scottish, the word is ax, and it would be considered completely appropriate in Scottish. So when you look at this word and wonder where it came from, it's not some modern change in how the word is pronounced. It's quite ancient as far as the English language goes. Hello to Lynn in the chat room. It's good to see you, Lynn. And this is one of the interesting things about language. It's far more complex than we like to give it credit for. And I find that complexity very interesting. Now, talking about education, one of the things I wanted to talk about today is the idea of education by apprenticeship. And when we talk about things like Wiccan or pagan education, this is often something that comes up. As a co-founder of witchschool.com, I was, along with Sir Ed Hubbard and Lisa Tuitt, one of the leaders in the idea of online education, which is a very different way of approaching education versus the older apprenticeship form of education. And it was considered very controversial at that time. And it's also relevant when we're talking about education for children, because if you're not aware of it, for many children of the upper classes, historically, their education, um, and not even necessarily of the upper classes, followed more of an apprenticeship type of program. In the upper classes, they commonly had tutors who were teaching very individualized programs based on what they knew. Um, in the lower classes, often people literally were apprentices and were getting their education that way. And you'll often hear people say that this was a far superior form of education. And, I'm going to agree that sometimes it is. And hello to Rev Ravenwolf in the chat room. Good to see you, Ravenwolf. And sometimes it's not. It depends entirely on who you're apprenticed to and what they do or do not know. Something like what we were just talking about. The origin, for example, of a certain word where there have been different suppositions made that are not necessarily correct versus one that is, it would be entirely dependent on whether the person teaching you knew about that, whether they had the necessary connections to know about it. Hello to Judy in the chat room. One of the things that you often see talked about in the community is the idea of misinformation. But this is where a lot of that came from. People in the apprentice teaching program own programs, when they were teaching people, they only knew what they knew. And prior to the internet, that was a far more limited thing. Where they had learned different things had everything to do with what they would then go on to teach. And I'm going to be one of those people who will tell you that this is still not something that everyone agrees upon, nor is it likely to be in my lifetime, might be in your lifetime. And one of the reasons is the amount of politics involved in it. But a lot of the things that are taught simply from personal experience are entirely dependent on that personal experience. And when we look again at children's education, I think that although if you have really good tutors, that sort of old apprenticeship style education probably is superior. It absolutely is dependent on who's teaching it. And I think having standardized materials was a tremendous advantage to moving education for the general population forward. I think it's also a tremendous thing for the pagan population and any other population to be able to say, yes, we all know these certain things. We may not agree on all of them, but at least we have a certain body of common knowledge, at least within our traditions, if not necessarily the entire community. And although I am aware of people who berate that change, I think it's a tremendous positive change. I was talking the other day about how when I was writing the Corellian standardized materials, I was trying to draw from as many different points of view as I could and make clear that not everybody agreed. When I did my my daily vlog for 10 years, I was very clear whenever possible that I was speaking, if in fact I was speaking from my own point of view versus what other people might believe. And I was very much at pains to say not everyone agrees. Sometimes I'd go through the different ways that different people thought about different subjects because it's good to know. It doesn't matter if I agree with them. It may still be useful for you to know. And in many cases, it's been useful for me to know. The way that different people look at different things, even if they're not necessarily, quote, right, end quote, can still be enlightening and it can still teach you things that you might not otherwise think of. So knowing the larger number of ways that people look at things is very useful. Let us take something like the idea of the planes of existence. When I was writing the Corellian standardized materials, writing about this subject, I immediately pointed out there is not a universal agreement on the planes of existence, how many they are, what they are, etc. And hello to Judy in the chat room. And Judy says, I've been a long-time follower, just got back into YouTube, and boom, there you are on TV. It's good to see you, Judy. Thank you for being here. But with planes of existence, I pointed out, how could there be? They're an arbitrary way that we try to organize a process that doesn't really have absolute stops and starts. We organize it so we can understand it. So naturally, different people have seen it in different ways. This is also true of the chakras, whatever you may want to call them. And this is another area, both of these, where apprentice systems can do you very badly if the person who's teaching you doesn't know what they're talking about beyond one source. If I had $1, there I go using that phrase again, but if I had $1 for every time I've heard someone say that chakras are a Hindu system that can only follow that one particular point of view, I'd have quite a few dollars. It's also nonsense. Chakras are found in Hinduism, but also in Jainism and Buddhism, and they've been present in Western philosophy since Plato. Plato wrote about the chakras. What on earth are you talking about? You need to have a wider range of reference to understand this subject, and they've been present in modern metaphysics since at least well in the 1800s. There's nothing particularly new about this in Western metaphysics. So to act like it only existed in one quarter of the world when it was in so many different quarters of the world is not good. Same with the planes of existence. If someone wants to say they can only be this, and nobody else has ever seen it any other way, they're lying to you, because lots of people have seen it other ways. Now, they may prefer a certain way, and you may too. You may choose to follow their way of seeing it. But it's good to know that there have been different ones. And to know that, you have to have a wide background. And this is one of the reasons I favor using larger institutions to teach, using wider references to teach, because they give you that wider background. And avoiding common knowledge as your only source of teaching. When I was reworking the Corellian standardized materials a couple of years ago, speaking of Plato and the chakras, I made it a point to include the classical Greek names for the chakras, which I had not done the first time, although I had mentioned them. But I made it a point to include them so that people had them, so they can go research it. I did not include it the first time because at that time, I did not myself know those names. I had heard them, but I had not retained them because I'd only heard them once or twice. But with the modern world of the internet, it was quite easy to find them and include them. I also talked about Chinese systems of the chakras that you find, for example, in Taoism, the Celtic system of chakras, which are described as cauldrons, which is also the term used in the Chinese system. A wide range of different ways that people have looked at energy systems of the body, that it might as well be described as chakras, because we all know that term, and they work the same way. And it's interesting to see not only how broad this idea has been, which also speaks to how early it may be, but also the different ways that different cultures have used them. If you look at the Celtic system and the Taoist system, they both feature only 3 cauldrons, but they readily correspond to 3 of the standard chakras most people would use when working with chakras. If you look at a variety of different forms of chakras. You'll find that 7 is the most common, but some people use as many as 15. Um, and what does that have to do with anything? Well, if you studied our Corellian standardized materials, you will have found the binder system of chakras, which in my opinion answers that question. The binder system points out that each of the chakras has many different points within it. What Binder did not say, but I will say, is that where we make our divisions are largely arbitrary for our purposes. So some people may see some of those chakra points as being separate chakras, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. They certainly could work that way. This is why you'll find that when some people try to locate their chakras, they're not always in the same place that other people will find theirs, because they've developed certain points within their chakras more thoroughly than others, which is normal, because naturally we do work with certain things more, no matter what we're working with. That's why, some people, when they work with their third eye, they'll see it down here, but others will see it up higher. And these are all parts of the third eye. It's a fascinating subject. Binder is the only person I know who's done really deep work with that. And it's quite a fascinating thing. It's also the chapter most people hate most in second degree, because it's full of these tiny little details. I often tell people, the reason I included the binder system of chakras, because when I first heard it, I thought, oh my, this is not terribly useful, until he started to talk about things I'd personally experienced. How there were certain chakras, for example, in the pupil of the eye, where I'd had energetic experiences that only really make sense if there's a chakra point there. Chakra points in certain parts of the jawline, in certain parts of the ear. And it made sense to me because I'd had those experiences. And then I started to look at other things. And the system that at first just seemed hopelessly confusing started to make real sense to me. But it's only going to be of use to you if you're working with chakras quite extensively. So that to me is an example of both the apprentice system and the institutional system of teaching, because that's there because I knew it as an individual, not because it's part of the common knowledge. And there are a lot of things that are like that in the Corellian standardized materials, things that I had access to that I included that you might not easily find elsewhere. And I think that it's important that we continue to do that when we have access to such knowledge. It's also important that we continue to point out there are always different ways to look at them. And Judy was talking a few moments ago about how she'd been a long-time follower of us on YouTube, and that was a great adventure. And for a solid 10 years, I did Reverend Don's daily vlog, and I regarded that as an important part of education. I still do. And I answered pretty much every question that I could get to. There were times when there were so many questions I wouldn't get to everything, but I tried. Probably the best commentary that I received doing Reverend Don's vlog was that I answered every question. I'm not entirely sure if it was meant as a compliment or that the viewer thought that I perhaps answered questions that maybe didn't really need answering, but I took it as a compliment. Because I didn't dismiss anyone's question. And some of those questions, I know perfectly well there are people who have simply said, this is a foolish question, I'm not going to deal with it. But I don't believe there are foolish questions. I'm a believer in the idea that the foolish question is the one you don't ask. But any question you can answer, you should. So I had someone ask me once for a spell to become a mermaid. I answered that question. How did I answer it? The same way as I talked about becoming a werewolf to another question. And that is that, to the best of my knowledge, we cannot do this in a physical way. Um, might be possible. I've never seen anything that would lead me to believe that it is. But when we talk about this sort of shape-shifting, what we're really talking about, generally speaking, in the magical world is astral shape-shifting, and we do that all the time. Lots of people who practice astral travel will take many different forms to do it. Um, and this is um, very often the origin of things like the stories of werewolves, people turning into different animals, people becoming things like mermaids. In that sense, yes, you can. I had a question once about the idea of throwing fireballs. Um, I'm sure there are people who would have readily dismissed that question, but it's not a readily dismissible question. First, we work with energy all the time. Of course you can throw a fireball. Um, if you can create a ball of energy and place it outside of yourself, which we do all the time in all kinds of different magical work, of course you can throw a fireball. You just did it. You just didn't think of it in those terms. So yes, that's very much something that we do. Now, you're not going to see it the way you'd see it in an anime. Um, but if you're visualizing strongly, you might. Um, and it So Ravenwolf says, in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn system, students are paired with a mentor through first degree and aren't allowed to advance until that student is ready. For us in the Corellian system, particularly if you're studying for clergy, you do have to have a mentor, and it requires that mentor to agree on the student being ready. Um, and if a student wants to take a long time, they can. Um, but we also are believers in the idea that you get as much out of it as you put into it. And we're not big on the idea of gatekeeping. And I'm a great believer in the idea that knowledge should be shared. A wise man once said that we must constantly guard the mysteries by constantly revealing them. And I very much believe in that point of view. So yes, the mixture of standardized materials and mentors is very effective. But it does depend on the mentor. But that's always true with any mentor. But I have to point out on this whole subject that we've been talking about today, that the vast majority of people back in the day were not taught in this apprentice system. They were taught by what books they read, because there was no one for them to apprentice under. And what books they were able to get back in the 70s and the 80s, and even more if you go back farther than that, were limited and not easy to come by. And this is something I think people tend to forget. And I think people have romanticized the past, largely in terms of this idea that there were these small, intense groups that taught everyone by hand. They were never the majority of the community. The majority of the community were self-trained at every stage. And any other idea, I think, is foolish and disregards the larger part of the past. I've had people try to tell me that everyone in the community read a particular magazine that they read. That was never true. This community was never that united. It did not come from a single origin. And certainly in my experience, I've known people who came from many origins. One of the things that was really impressive to me when we were doing the New Witches' Balls in Chicago is that we would see people come from way outside the pagan community of Chicago who had been running temples for years and years. But they were not part of that community for whatever reason. Sometimes they weren't even really aware of it. Other times they'd made a choice to avoid it. And sometimes they simply came from a different kind of background. And this idea that there were no variations in background is simply not true. It may serve certain people's ego, but it's not true. And if you go back and look at actual history and things actually written, you can readily see many different backgrounds that ultimately have kind of come together today and only somewhat come together today. And it is important, I think, to remember that the metaphysical community in general, even if we want to limit ourselves to speaking of the pagan community, comes from a wide range of different backgrounds. And to think that any one thing is going to apply to all of them is rather foolish. And I'll name one for you that I refer to all the time, and that's the Fellowship of Isis, in which I am an archpriest of Isis and a knight commander in the Noble Order of Tara, and an archdruid in the Druid Grove of Danu, etc. But if you look at their background, it's very different from, say, someone who would think of themselves as Wiccan. Everything down to how they do ritual is very, very different. And why wouldn't it be? They come from a different background. As an organization, they wouldn't even consider themselves pagan. They considered themselves goddess worshippers, or worshippers of the female divine. But they are a very important organization. And they've had a very important influence on that pagan community because so many of their members would define themselves that way and hold high places in the pagan community. And so Icean ideas certainly have influenced the pagan community, but their origins are very, very different. A lot of them date to Clonigal Castle in Ireland itself and people who were around it back in the 20s and 30s, who Lady Olivia and the late Derry, her brother, were learning from, Lawrence Durden Robertson. Olivia says that the entire Druid program in the Fellowship of Isis is closely related to the gardener at the castle, who related himself as being a Druid and had all these different things to teach. That he was willing to teach to the children of the family, which is a very different origin from some other branches of Druids, and also not so very different from some other branches of Druids, many of which have claimed to be hereditary in Ireland in their origins. And if you look at what we actually know about the ancient Druids, and if we look at those people claiming to be hereditary Druids in the last few centuries, there's not necessarily that strong a reason to think that there isn't a close similarity in what they're talking about. The term Druid means wise person. And most of those hereditary Druids who claimed that status were universalists in their point of view. But I don't know that the ancient ones necessarily were not. We don't really know what they believed as such. And so that's an interesting point that maybe someday someone will study. I don't know that anyone has to date, but it's one of those interesting things to look at. With that, I see that we've come to the end of our half hour. So let us close with our prayer as we commonly do, and I will see you again on Monday. And for those in the Danville area, tomorrow I'll be reading at Willows and Moon, and I hope to see many of you there. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for the role you play in our lives, and we ask you to help us to have certainty in the paths that we choose and the preferences that we choose in our lives. Help us to look at the many different ways that every subject can be seen and choose those which are best for us as we go forward. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, We thank you for the role you play in our lives. Knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we bid you hail and farewell, and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always. Also,